In the dusty courthouse of Millfield, a widowed schoolteacher was about to make the purchase that would expose a 7-year conspiracy. What started as a simple land auction took a shocking turn when she came face to face with evidence that powerful men had been systematically murdering families for mineral rights. Margaret, Maggie, Rowland wasn't your typical grieving widow. For 12 years, she had spent her life educating children and reading people's lies with a teacher's keen eye. Known for her stubborn pursuit of truth and refusal to accept convenient explanations, when she encountered a wild mustang circling the sealed valley, she had no idea she was walking into a network of corruption that reached the territorial capital. Maggie's decision to investigate the worthless land for 25 cents would lead to the unraveling of a conspiracy that had claimed dozens of innocent lives. What began as a quarter's worth of barren ground would become a fight for justice that transformed a broken woman into an unstoppable force. The territory would never be the same after she proved that some truths refused to stay buried, no matter how much stone and silence are piled on top of them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 25 cents. That's all Margaret Rowland had left after the land auctioneer's gavel fell, and that's exactly what she'd paid for the most worthless piece of ground in 3 counties. The crowd that had gathered outside Millfield's courthouse that October morning erupted in laughter as she stepped forward to claim her deed. Maggie's gone and bought herself a grave, someone called out from the back. Cursed ground, muttered old Henrik Müller, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Rangers sealed it off for good reason. Maggie ignored the jeers and pressed her quarter into the auctioneer's palm. Her fingers trembled, not from nerves, but from the fury that had been building in her chest for months. Ever since Thomas had died in that unavoidable accident at the railroad site, she'd learned to recognize the taste of lies. And everything about this auction reeked of them. Why so cheap? She asked the auctioneer, a thin man whose eyes couldn't quite meet hers. Water's been blocked for near 7 years now, he replied, shuffling his papers. Landslide took out the natural dam. Rangers say it's too dangerous to clear. Soil's unstable. But Maggie had taught school for 12 years before Thomas died. She knew when someone was reciting a lesson they'd memorized rather than understood. The auctioneer's words came too smooth, too practiced. Dangerous how? She pressed. The man's Adam's apple bobbed. Just dangerous, ma'am. Now, if you'll sign here, as she walked away with the deed tucked in her coat pocket. Maggie caught fragments of whispered conversations. Should have stayed. Buried, no good'll come of this. Rangers won't like it. Samuel. Pike fell into step beside her as she untied her mare from the hitching post. The rancher was built like a tree stump, broad, weathered, and stubborn, but today his usual confidence seemed shaken. Maggie, he said quietly, you don't know what you've just done. I bought land that nobody else wanted, she replied, checking her saddle cinch with deliberate precision. Seems like good business to me. That valley's been sealed for good reason. His voice dropped lower. Some things are better left alone. She turned to face him fully. Samuel Pike had never struck her as a man who scared easily, but there was something haunted in his weathered features. What kind of reason, Samuel? He glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. The kind that gets folks buried alongside their questions. Before she could respond, he'd melted back into the dispersing crowd, leaving Maggie with more questions than answers. She mounted her mare and rode south toward her new property, the deed feeling heavier in her pocket with each mile. The valley stretched before her like a wound in the earth. What should have been lush grazing land, fed by mountain streams, was instead a bowl of cracked mud and stubborn scrub brush. At the far end, a crude dam of timber and stone blocked what had once been the valley's lifeline, a stream that should have been flowing strong this time of year. Maggie dismounted and walked the perimeter, her schoolteacher's eye cataloguing details that didn't fit the official story. The landslide looked nothing like the natural rockfalls she'd seen in these mountains. instead of the chaotic tumble of stone and earth she expected. The blockage showed signs of deliberate arrangement. Rocks stacked with an engineer's precision, gaps filled with smaller stones in a pattern that spoke of human hands. She knelt beside the dam, running her fingers along the weathered timbers. Tool marks scored the wood, fresh cuts that couldn't be more than a season old. Someone had been maintaining this barrier, reinforcing it, making sure it held. A shadow passed overhead. Maggie looked up to see a pair of ravens circling against the afternoon sky, their harsh calls echoing off the valley walls. In her grandmother's stories, ravens were messengers between the world of the living and the realm of secrets. Today, watching them wheel and dive above the barren earth, Maggie felt the weight of that old superstition. She spent the remainder of the afternoon walking every inch of her 25-cent purchase. Along the valley's eastern edge, she found flood lines etched into the cliff face. Not one line, as a natural disaster might leave, but multiple marks at different heights, as if water had been deliberately raised and lowered over time. The highest mark stood 15 feet above the current ground level. As the sun began to sink behind the western peaks, Maggie made one more discovery that set her pulse racing. Half buried beneath years of accumulated sand and debris, she uncovered a fragment of rusted metal, part of a surveyor's marker, stamped with numbers that meant nothing to her, but proved this valley had been mapped with care. The ravens called once more before disappearing into the gathering dusk, leaving Maggie alone with the growing certainty that she'd just bought herself a mystery wrapped in 25 cents worth of lies. She remounted her mare and headed home through the purple twilight, her mind turning over everything she'd observed. The valley wasn't cursed, it was hidden, and whatever truth lay buried beneath years of dust and silence was worth more than the quarter she'd paid to uncover it. The next morning brought Margaret Rowland back to Millfield's main street, but this time she came hunting for answers instead of land. She'd spent a sleepless night thinking about tool marks and flood lines, about Samuel Pike's warning and the auctioneer's nervous eyes. If the valley held secrets, someone in this town knew what they were. She started at Henley's general store, where gossip flowed as freely as the coffee. Martha Henley looked up from her ledger as the bell above the door announced Maggie's entrance. "Heard you bought yourself some trouble yesterday," Martha said without preamble. "I bought land," Maggie replied, settling herself at the counter where she could observe the other customers. "Same as anyone might. That ain't the same as anyone's land, and you know it." Martha poured coffee without being asked, her movements sharp with disapproval. "That valley's been sealed since before the Roosevelt administration. Rangers got good reason for keeping folks out." "What reason?" Martha's lips pressed into a thin line. "Landslide. Made the whole area unstable, dangerous." The same rehearsed answer Maggie had heard yesterday. She took a sip of coffee and tried a different approach. Must have been hard on the families who lost grazing rights when it happened. Something flickered in Martha's eyes. Not fear like Samuel Pike's, but sadness mixed with old anger. "Hard doesn't begin to cover it," she said quietly. 3 families lost everything when the Rangers closed that valley. The Castellis, the Washingtons, and my sister's family, the Brewsters. All of them had to sell out, move on to poorer land. Where did they go? But Martha had already said too much. She turned away, busying herself with inventory that didn't need counting. "That's ancient history, Mrs. Rowland. Best left buried." Maggie finished her coffee in thoughtful silence. As she prepared to leave, a small voice piped up from behind the pickle barrel. My grandpa knew the valley before. A girl of perhaps 10 emerged from her hiding spot, clutching a rag doll and regarding Maggie with solemn brown eyes. Martha moved quickly to shush the child, but Maggie was quicker. "What did your grandpa tell you?" she asked, crouching down to the girl's level. "Said there used to be a town there. Little one, just a few families, but they had good water and the soil was rich." The girl's voice dropped to a whisper. "Said the Rangers made them leave in the middle of the night. Wouldn't let them take nothing but the clothes on their backs. Rosie." Martha's voice cracked like a whip. "You get on home to your mother right now." The girl scampered toward the door, but as she passed Maggie, she pressed something into her palm. A fragment of paper, yellowed with age. Then she was gone, leaving Maggie with a piece of what looked like an old map. Outside the store, Maggie examined her prize in the morning light. It showed part of the valley's eastern approach, with notations in faded ink marking trails and water sources. But most intriguing were the penciled additions in a different hand, notes about alternate routes and ranger blind spots. Someone had been studying ways to enter the valley without being seen. She found Samuel Pike at the blacksmith shop, supervising the shoeing of his prize stallion. He looked up as she approached, and she saw his shoulders tense. Maggie, figured you'd have come to your senses by now. Help me understand something, Samuel. She kept her voice level, conversational. Yesterday you warned me about asking questions. Today I'm wondering what happened to the families who used to graze cattle in my valley. Samuel's weathered hands stilled on the horse's neck. That's exactly the kind of question that gets people hurt. Who hurt them? The blacksmith, a burly German named Klaus, paused in his work. The shop fell silent except for the hiss of cooling metal. You don't know what you're stirring up, Samuel said finally. Some stones are better left unturned. Thomas used to say that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you bury it. Maggie moved closer, her voice dropping. He said that right before his accident at the railroad site. The accident the rangers declared unavoidable. Samuel's face went pale. Klaus set down his hammer with deliberate care. Mrs. Rowland, Klaus said in his thick accent, perhaps it is time you spoke with someone who was here when the valley was sealed. Klaus. Samuel's voice held a warning, but the blacksmith continued. My wife's grandmother, she is old now, but her memory is sharp. She remembers the night they came for the valley families. She remembers the screaming. The word hung in the air like smoke from the forge. Maggie felt something cold settle in her stomach. What kind of screaming? Klaus glanced at Samuel, then back at Maggie. The kind that stops sudden in the middle of the night. The kind followed by silence that lasts for years. Before either man could say more, the shop door opened with a bang. Ranger Elias Broderick filled the doorway, his uniform crisp despite the morning heat, his pale eyes taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of a predator. Gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years in service. His gaze settled on Maggie. Mrs. Rowland, I hear congratulations are in order. New landowner? That's right. Maggie met his stare without flinching. Interesting choice of property. Most folks consider that valley more trouble than it's worth. Most folks didn't see the potential I saw. Broderick's smile was as cold as January morning. Potential can be a dangerous thing, ma'am, especially when it involves unstable terrain. I'd hate to see another accident in that area. The word accident carried enough weight to crush stone. Maggie understood the message perfectly. Some accidents weren't accidents at all, and curiosity could be fatal. I'll be careful, she said. See that you are. Broderick touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that felt more like a threat than courtesy. Gentlemen. After he left, the shop remained silent for a long moment. Finally, Samuel spoke. You've got sand, Maggie, I'll give you that. But sand won't stop a bullet. Maggie folded the map fragment and tucked it into her pocket alongside the deed. Maybe not, but it might be enough to uncover the truth. As she walked back to her mare, she could feel eyes watching her from windows and doorways. The town of Millfield had been keeping secrets for 7 years, and now those secrets had a new owner. The question was whether she'd live long enough to understand what she'd really bought for 25 cents. 3 days later, Margaret Rowland returned to her valley armed with more than curiosity. She'd packed her saddlebags with a surveyor's level Thomas had left behind, rope and a small pickaxe. The map fragment had shown her a trail along the eastern ridge that would give her a better view of the dam's construction. The morning mist clung to the valley floor as she guided her mare up the narrow track. From this vantage point, the deliberate nature of the water blockage became even more obvious. The dam wasn't a hasty pile of rock and timber. It was engineered, built to last. and maintained with care that spoke of regular visits. She tethered her horse and made her way down into the valley on foot, Thomas's surveyor level bouncing against her hip. The closer she got to the dam, the more evidence she found of recent human activity. Bootprints in the dried mud, barely visible but definitely there. A pile of fresh-cut timber stacked behind a stand of scrub oak, the wood still showing saw marks. But it was the holes that made her blood run cold, drilled into the rock face at regular intervals. Each hole the perfect size for a stick of dynamite. The edges were sharp, clean, recent work. Someone had been preparing to blast, either to reinforce the dam or to bring down more of the canyon wall. Maggie knelt beside one of the holes, running her finger along the rim. The drilling would have taken hours, required specialized equipment. This wasn't the work of casual trespassers. This was systematic, professional. A pebble skittered down from above. She looked up just in time to see a section of loose stone break away from the cliff face directly overhead. Instinct sent her diving sideways, rolling behind the shelter of a boulder as rocks the size of dinner plates crashed down where she'd been kneeling moments before. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself against the stone, waiting for the cascade to end. When silence returned, she peered cautiously around her shelter. The rockfall had revealed something that made her forget her near-death experience entirely. Bones, white against the dark earth, partially buried but unmistakably the skeleton of a horse. A large one, judging by the massive skull. But as Maggie approached, she realized this wasn't just any horse. The confirmation came when she spotted the tattered remains of a rope still wrapped around what had been the animal's neck. This horse had been tied here, trapped when the valley was sealed. She spent the next hour carefully excavating the remains, her schoolteacher's methodical nature taking over. The horse had been a mustang, probably a stallion, judging by the bone structure. Wild horses didn't wear ropes, which meant he'd been caught. Likely by one of the displaced families. They'd left him behind when the rangers came. Maggie gathered stones to build a cairn over the skeleton, offering a prayer for the animal that had died alone and forgotten. As she worked, movement caught her eye. A young mustang stood watching her from the far side of the valley, coat the color of storm clouds, mane wild and tangled. The horse approached cautiously, nostrils flaring as it tested her scent. When it came close enough, Maggie could see the intelligence in its dark eyes, the wariness that spoke of survival in harsh country. "You're kin to him, aren't you?" she said softly. The mustang snorted and tossed its head, but didn't retreat. Maggie had always been good with horses. Thomas used to say she could speak their language. Today she sensed this one needed what she needed, a companion in a place that held too many secrets. She finished the cairn and gathered her tools, the mustang following at a distance as she explored more of the valley. Every 100 yards brought new evidence of sabotage disguised as maintenance. Tool marks on timber that should have been weathered smooth. Fresh mortar between stones that should have been crumbling with age. Most damning of all, she found a cache hidden beneath an overhang, surveying equipment, explosives and a ledger book wrapped in oiled cloth. The entries were in several different hands, but they all told the same story. Regular visits to inspect and reinforce the valley's closure. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks ago. Dam holding steady. No signs of natural erosion. Recommend continued monitoring. EBEB Elias. Broderick. The ranger wasn't just maintaining a landslide barrier. He was maintaining a lie as the afternoon sun slanted, long across the valley floor. Maggie sat on a boulder and considered what she'd learned. The valley hadn't been closed because of an accident. It had been sealed deliberately, trapping families and livestock inside, then abandoned to die. But why? The mustang had settled nearby, cropping grass with the patience of wild things. Ravens called from the rim above, their voices echoing off stone walls that had witnessed crimes and kept them buried for 7 years. Maggie thought about the bone pile she'd found, the holes drilled for explosives, the careful maintenance of a dam that should have been left to crumble. Someone had invested enormous effort in keeping this valley empty. Someone with resources, authority, and a willingness to kill to protect whatever secret lay hidden here. The same someone who had declared Thomas's death an unavoidable accident. She stood and shouldered her pack, the ledger book secure in her saddlebags alongside the deed and map fragment. The mustang raised its head, watching her with those dark, intelligent eyes. "You can't come home with me," she said. "But I'll be back." The horse snorted as if to say it would be waiting. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As Maggie climbed back toward her mare, she could feel the weight of watching eyes from the rim above. She disturbed something today, uncovered evidence that powerful people had worked hard to hide. The question now was whether she'd live long enough to understand what it all meant. But one thing was certain. Her 25 cents had purchased more than worthless land. She'd bought herself a mystery that reached into the highest levels of local authority. And a truth that someone was willing to kill to keep buried. The mustang called once from the valley floor, a wild sound that echoed off the stone walls like a promise or a warning. Behind her, shadows lengthened across the ground where bones had lain forgotten for 7 years and where fresh holes waited for their next load of dynamite. The valley remembered everything. Now Maggie was beginning to remember too, to piece together the fragments of a story that began with displaced families and ended with carefully maintained lies. Tomorrow, she decided, she would need allies. Because whatever the rangers had buried in this valley was worth more than land or water rights. It was worth killing for. Evelyn Hart lived in a tidy house at the edge of town, where ranger families were expected to maintain appearances that matched their authority. Maggie had watched the young woman from a distance during church services, noting the way she held herself apart from other girls her age, the careful way she spoke when her father was present. Today, Maggie knocked on Evelyn's door while Ranger Broderick was away on patrol. The woman who answered was perhaps 25, with intelligent green eyes and prematurely serious features. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, as if she were trying to make herself invisible. "Mrs. Rowland." Evelyn's voice carried no surprise, only resignation. "I wondered when you'd come calling. May I come in?" Evelyn stepped aside, but her posture remained guarded. The parlor was clean and sparse, decorated with the kind of careful neutrality that revealed nothing about its occupant's personality. Maggie settled herself on the horsehair sofa and got straight to the point. "Your father's been maintaining that dam for years. I don't know what you're talking about." The denial came too quickly and too practiced. Maggie pulled the ledger from her bag and opened it to the page with Broderick's initials. "EB regular inspections. Recent blasting preparations. This is your father's handwriting." Evelyn's face went white as she stared at the evidence. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock. Then she sank into the chair across from Maggie, her composure cracking like ice in spring. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. "I suspected from the day I bought the valley. The dam's too well built, too carefully maintained. Natural disasters don't require regular upkeep." Evelyn's hands twisted in her lap. "I've lived with suspicions my whole life. Little things that didn't add up. The way he'd disappear for days at a time, claiming patrol duties that weren't on any schedule. The locked filing cabinet in his office. The nightmares. What kind of nightmares? He talks in his sleep. Names mostly. People I've never heard of, but he sounds afraid when he says them." Evelyn looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "He wasn't always like this. When I was little, he was different, kind. But something changed about 7 years ago. 7 years. The same time the valley was sealed. What happened then? Judge Dyer started visiting more often. There were meetings late at night with men I didn't recognize. And Father began locking his office." Evelyn stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "I tried to convince myself it was normal ranger business. But normal doesn't require such secrecy." Maggie chose her next words carefully. "I found evidence that families were displaced when the valley was closed. Forced out in the middle of the night. Evelyn's reflection in the window showed a face etched with pain. There are documents in Father's locked cabinet. I've seen glimpses when he thought I wasn't watching. Property transfers signed by Judge Dyer. Survey maps marked with red ink. And accident reports that don't match the stories people tell, including my husband's accident report. The question hung between them like a blade. Evelyn turned from the window, her expression haunted. Thomas Rowland, railroad foreman. Report filed by E. Broderick, witnessed by Judge Dyer. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Marked as equipment failure, but the original report, the one underneath, before the alterations, listed suspicious circumstances requiring investigation. The room seemed to tilt around Maggie. She gripped the sofa arm, fighting waves of grief and fury. You've read the original. Father keeps carbon copies of everything, even the versions he's supposed to destroy. I think he's afraid someday he'll need them for protection. Evelyn moved closer, her voice urgent. Mrs. Rowland, you have to understand what you're up against. This isn't just about one blocked valley. It's about a system of control that reaches from the ranger station all the way to the territorial capital. Then help me tear it down. Evelyn shook her head. You don't know what you're asking. These men have killed to keep their secrets. They won't hesitate to kill again. They already killed my husband. Maggie stood, her decision crystallized. They killed the families in that valley. How many more people have to die before someone stands up to them? For a moment, the two women faced each other across the small parlor, one driven by grief and justice, the other paralyzed by fear and loyalty. Then Evelyn's shoulders straightened, and Maggie saw steel replace uncertainty in those green eyes. What do you need? Access to those files, proof that Judge Dyer authorized the valley's closure, and evidence of what really happened to the families who lived there. Evelyn nodded slowly. Father's going to be away tomorrow night, checking the northern boundary. I could get you into his office. That's dangerous for you. If he finds out, he's going to find out eventually anyway. Evelyn's voice had found new strength. I've been his accomplice through silence for too long. Maybe it's time I chose which side I'm really on. As Maggie prepared to leave, Evelyn caught her arm. Mrs. Rowland, there's something else you should know. Judge Dyer's been asking questions about you. Who you've talked to, what you've been doing out at that valley. Father thinks you're just a grieving widow looking for someone to blame. But the judge, he's worried. Good, Maggie replied. Worried men make mistakes. But as she rode home through the gathering dusk, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that she was the one walking into a trap. The mustang from the valley had appeared again, shadowing her path at a distance, its wild presence both comforting and unsettling. Tomorrow night would bring answers. The question was whether she'd survive long enough to use them. The ranger station stood dark against the star-filled sky, its windows blank as dead eyes. Maggie approached from the east, using shadows and her knowledge of the town's layout to avoid the main streets. Evelyn had left the back door unlocked as promised, its hinges oiled to prevent betraying squeaks. Inside, the building smelled of leather, gun oil, and old paper. Maggie struck a match, shielding the flame with her cupped hand as she oriented herself. Evelyn appeared from the shadows, her face pale but determined. Father's office is this way, she whispered. They moved through the narrow hallway, past mounted maps and wanted posters, to a door marked with Ranger Broderick's nameplate. Evelyn produced a ring of keys, her hands surprisingly steady as she worked the lock. The office was larger than Maggie had expected, dominated by a heavy oak desk and filing cabinets that lined 3 walls. But it was the locked cabinet in the corner that drew their attention, a metal strongbox that looked more suitable for a bank than a ranger station. Here, Evelyn selected another key, this one smaller and more ornate. He keeps the sensitive files in here. The cabinet opened with a soft click, revealing folders arranged with military precision. Evelyn's hands moved with practiced efficiency, selecting documents she'd obviously studied before. Property transfers, she said, handing Maggie a thick folder. Every family displaced when the valley was sealed. Maggie opened the file by matchlight, scanning names and signatures. The Castellis, the Washingtons, the Brewsters, all forced to sell their land for fractions of its worth. All sales authorized by Judge Abram Dyer, but it was the dates that made her blood run cold. Every transfer was dated the day after the supposed landslide. They had the paperwork ready before the families were even told to leave, she breathed. It gets worse. Evelyn handed her another folder. Accident reports. This file contained death certificates, injury claims, and incident reports stretching back years. Maggie's husband's name appeared near the top, but as she read, she realized Thomas was just one victim in a pattern of convenient accidents. Workers who asked too many questions. Settlers who complained about restricted access to water rights. Business owners who refused to sell to certain buyers. All of them had met with unfortunate ends, all properly documented by Ranger Broderick and witnessed by Judge Dyer. "My God," Maggie whispered. "How many people have they killed?" "I stopped counting at 15. Evelyn's voice was hollow. "And those are just the ones Father documented. There could be more." A sound from outside froze them both. Bootsteps on gravel, approaching the building's front entrance. Evelyn's eyes went wide with terror. "He's back early." They scrambled to replace the files, but there were too many documents scattered across the desk. The front door opened with a creak that seemed to echo through the building like thunder. "Take what you can," Evelyn whispered frantically. "I'll distract him." But before either woman could move, a familiar voice cut through the darkness. "Ladies, I think you'd better step away from that cabinet." Samuel Pike emerged from the shadows near the window, his weathered face grim in the matchlight. Maggie's heart sank. Their last ally had turned against them. "Samuel, please." "Quiet." His voice was sharp, but something in his eyes made Maggie pause. "Broderick's coming up the front steps. Evelyn, can you get us out the back way?" Understanding flooded through her. Samuel hadn't come to betray them. He'd come to warn them. They grabbed what documents they could carry and fled through the rear of the building, slipping into the alley just as the front door banged open. Behind them they could hear Broderick's voice calling out, suspicious and alert. They didn't stop running until they reached the cemetery at the edge of town, where weathered headstones provided cover, and the sound of their breathing could be masked by wind through the cottonwoods. "How did you know where to find us?" Maggie gasped. Samuel's face was haggard. "Because I've been watching that building for weeks, hoping someone would finally have the courage to break into those files. You knew what was in there." "I suspected." He settled heavily against a granite monument. "My brother Jake was one of the first to die when they started clearing people out of the valley. Official cause of death was a hunting accident, shot by his own rifle while climbing over a fence. But you don't believe it." Samuel's laugh was bitter. "Jake was the best hunter in 3 counties. He'd been handling firearms since he was 10 years old. The idea that he'd accidentally shoot himself while climbing a fence." He shook his head. "But Broderick wrote up the report, Dyer signed off on it, and Jake was buried without so much as an investigation." Evelyn had been silent through this exchange, clutching the stolen documents against her chest. Now she spoke up, her voice thick with shame. "I've known for years that something was wrong. But he's my father. I kept telling myself there had to be explanations, good reasons for everything." She looked up at the stars, tears tracking down her cheeks. "I've been a coward." "You're here now," Maggie said gently. "That's what matters." Samuel studied the documents they'd retrieved, his expression growing darker with each page. "This is bigger than I thought. They didn't just kill people to steal land. They've been systematically eliminating anyone who might expose a larger conspiracy." "What kind of conspiracy?" "The kind that requires Judge Dyer's signature on every death certificate and property transfer." Samuel held up a document that made Maggie's blood freeze. "Look at this. A survey report from before the valley was sealed, showing mineral deposits worth thousands of dollars." The pieces finally clicked into place. The valley wasn't just good grazing land. It was valuable for what lay beneath the soil. Someone had discovered that value, arranged to clear out the legitimate owners, and then sealed the area to prevent anyone else from learning the truth. They killed entire families for mining rights, Evelyn whispered. And they'll kill us too if we don't move fast, Samuel added. Broderick will know someone was in his office. It won't take him long to figure out who. Maggie folded the documents and tucked them inside her coat. Then we'd better make sure these papers see the light of day before he gets the chance. But as they prepared to leave the cemetery, a figure stepped out from behind the largest monument. Ranger Broderick stood silhouetted against the stars, his rifle cradled casually in his arms. "I thought I might find you here," he said conversationally. "Amazing how predictable people become when they think they're being clever." The three conspirators froze as Broderick emerged fully into the moonlight. His uniform was crisp despite the late hour, his pale eyes reflecting starlight like a predator's. The rifle remained loose in his grip, but the threat was unmistakable. "Evening, folks. Lovely night for grave robbing." His voice carried the same conversational tone he might use to discuss the weather. "Though I suspect it's not the dead you're after." Samuel shifted slightly, positioning himself between Broderick and the women. "Elias didn't expect to see you back so soon. Change of plans. Funny thing happened. I got a feeling someone might try to break into my office while I was away." Broderick's smile was cold as January frost. "Call it a father's intuition." His gaze settled on his daughter, and Maggie saw something flicker across his features, disappointment mixed with what might have been genuine pain. "Evelyn, I'm particularly surprised to see you here, though I suppose I shouldn't be. You always were too curious for your own good." "Father, Quiet!" The word cracked like a whip. "You've said enough with your actions." Broderick's attention turned to Maggie, and she felt the full weight of his scrutiny. This close, she could see the intelligence behind those pale eyes, the calculating mind that had orchestrated years of carefully planned murders. Mrs. Margaret Rowland, the schoolteacher who bought herself a valley full of trouble. "You know I tried to warn you off gently. Figured a grieving widow would eventually lose interest and move on, like my husband moved on." The words escaped before Maggie could stop them. Broderick's smile widened. Thomas was a good man. Loyal, hard-working, the kind of foreman who paid attention to details. Unfortunately, he started paying attention to the wrong details. What details? "Railroad surveys don't lie, Mrs. Rowland. Neither do geological reports. Your husband realized the route through the valley had been changed without proper authorization. Started asking questions about who ordered the change and why." Broderick shifted the rifle slightly. "Can't have railroad workers questioning their betters." The casual admission hit Maggie like a physical blow. Thomas hadn't died in an accident. He'd been murdered for discovering the truth about the valley's mineral wealth. "You killed him." "I solved a problem. Just like I've solved problems for 7 years, keeping this territory stable and profitable for the right people." Samuel's voice was tight with controlled fury. "Like you solved the problem of my brother Jake?" Jake Washington was stubborn. Refused to sell his grazing rights, kept bringing his cattle to water at the Valley Spring. Made it difficult to conduct business. Broderick shrugged. "Sometimes problems require permanent solutions." The ranger's casual admission of multiple murders should have been shocking. But Maggie found herself analyzing his words with the same methodical attention she brought to lesson planning. Broderick wasn't just confessing, he was explaining, as if he expected them to understand the logic behind his actions. "You're proud of it," she realized. "I'm practical. This territory was chaos when I arrived, settlers fighting over water rights. Blame jumpers shooting each other over worthless ground. No law, except what a man could enforce with his fists." Broderick's voice took on the cadence of a speech he'd given many times. "Judge Dyer and I brought order. We identified valuable resources and made sure they ended up in the right hands. We eliminated troublemakers before they could destabilize the community. You eliminated innocent families. I eliminated obstacles to progress." His tone remained maddeningly reasonable. "The valley contains enough copper and silver to fund territorial development for decades. But that only works if the mining rights belong to people with vision and capital, not dirt farmers and cattle ranchers. From somewhere in the distance came the sound Maggie had been hoping for, the wild call of the mustang from the valley. The horse had followed her again, drawn by some instinct that connected them across the miles of empty country. Broderick heard it too, his head turning slightly toward the sound. In that moment of distraction, Samuel moved. The rancher lunged forward, grabbing for the rifle. But Broderick was younger and had been expecting the attack. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs, fighting for control of the weapon. "Run!" Samuel shouted. Maggie grabbed Evelyn's hand, and they fled between the headstones, the sound of struggle echoing behind them. A gunshot split the night air, followed by a cry of pain that could have come from either man. They didn't stop until they reached Maggie's mare, hidden behind the cemetery chapel. As they mounted the horse, two riders on one animal, the mustang appeared from the darkness, its storm-cloud coat almost invisible against the night sky. "This way," Maggie whispered, guiding her mare toward the back trails that would take them away from town. But as they reached the edge of the cemetery, Broderick's voice carried through the darkness. "You can't run from the truth, Mrs. Rowland. That valley belongs to people who understand its value. You're just a schoolteacher playing with forces beyond your comprehension." His words followed them into the night, a promise of retribution that made the autumn air feel cold as winter. Behind them, Millfield slept on, unaware that the foundation of its ordered existence had just cracked wide open. Ahead lay the valley, with its buried secrets and hidden wealth, and perhaps the evidence they needed to expose the conspiracy that had claimed so many lives. The mustang ran beside them through the darkness, wild and free, leading them back to the place where the truth lay waiting beneath 7 years of carefully maintained lies. Dawn found them in the valley, exhausted and grieving. Samuel Pike lay buried beneath a cairn of stones they'd built at first light, his body recovered from the cemetery after Broderick had vanished into the night. The rancher had died protecting the documents that could expose the conspiracy. And now the weight of that sacrifice pressed down on Maggie like mountain stone. "He saved our lives," Evelyn said quietly, her hands still stained with dirt from the burial. "He saved more than that." Maggie pulled the stolen papers from her coat, their edges torn from the desperate flight. "He saved the truth." The mustang stood watch at the valley's rim, alert to any approach from the town. In daylight, its coat showed the deep grey of storm clouds, marked with darker lines across the shoulders that spoke of wild breeding and harder survival. "What now?" Evelyn asked. Maggie studied the documents Samuel had died protecting. Survey reports, mineral assessments, correspondence between Judge Dyer and territorial officials, evidence of a conspiracy that reached far beyond one blocked valley. But buried among the bureaucratic language, she found references to something that made her pulse quicken. "Look at this." She pointed to a geological survey dated 6 months before the valley's closure. Significant metallic deposits confirmed at depth of 15 to 20 feet, concentrated in the eastern sector. And this notation in the margin, removal of surface obstacles complete by autumn. "Surface obstacles," Evelyn repeated. They meant the families. But Maggie was reading deeper, her mind working through the implications. 15 to 20 feet deep. The eastern sector. She looked up at the valley around them, calculating distances and elevations. They never intended to mine from above. They were planning to tunnel. Tunnel from where? Maggie folded the papers and stood, her decision made. From outside the valley. Somewhere they could work without being observed. She turned to survey the eastern wall, where morning light revealed subtle differences in rock color and vegetation. "Help me find where they've been digging." They spent the morning exploring the eastern edge, the mustang trailing behind them like a wild dog. It was Evelyn who spotted the first sign, a depression in the ground where water had pooled and drained, leaving behind the kind of scar that marked recent excavation. "Here!" she called. Maggie joined her beside what looked like a shallow crater, perhaps 10 feet across and filled with loose stone and debris. But as they cleared away the camouflaging material, they discovered the depression was actually the collapsed entrance to a tunnel. "They've been digging for years," Maggie realized, using the sealed valley as cover while they excavated from the outside. The tunnel mouth was expertly concealed, reinforced with timber and disguised to look like natural erosion. But inside, Maggie could see the systematic work of professional miners, tool marks, support beams, and the dark promise of passages leading deep into the earth. "We need light," Evelyn said. They returned to the valley floor and built a small fire, fashioning torches from dead brush and pine pitch. The mustang watched their preparations with what seemed like approval, as if it understood they were finally doing something the dead horse from the cairn would have wanted. Armed with makeshift torches and the surveying tools from Maggie's saddlebags, they entered the tunnel. The passage was narrow but well constructed, sloping down at a gentle angle that spoke of careful engineering. After 20 feet, it opened into a larger chamber where the real work had been done. The chamber was filled with evidence of systematic looting, broken barrels that had once held personal belongings, surveying equipment marked with government stamps, and in the far corner, arranged with respectful care, the skeletal remains of at least a dozen people. Evelyn's torch illuminated skulls with bullet holes, rib bones shattered by gunshot, the scattered remains of families who had been murdered and hidden in the earth they'd tried to claim. "Dear God," she whispered, but Maggie was studying the arrangement. Of the bones, her schoolteacher's eye cataloguing details that told a story of systematic execution. Men, women, children, all killed quickly and efficiently, then buried in a place where they'd never be found. "They didn't just steal the valley," she said. "They used it as a mass grave." A raven's call echoed from the tunnel entrance, followed by another, then another. The mustang whinnied in alarm, the sound carrying clearly through the underground chamber. "Someone's coming," Evelyn breathed. They gathered what evidence they could carry, a few personal items, surveying equipment that proved the tunnel's purpose, and most importantly, a strongbox hidden behind the bones that contained correspondence between Judge Dyer and territorial officials. As they prepared to flee, Maggie took one last look at the remains of the valley's original inhabitants. These people had died for nothing more than living in the wrong place when powerful men decided it was valuable. "I promise you," she said to the silent bones, "your deaths won't be forgotten." They emerged from the tunnel to find the mustang dancing nervously at the valley's rim, its attention focused on something approaching from town. In the distance, dust clouds marked the approach of multiple riders, too many to be a casual patrol. "Broderick's bringing help," Evelyn realized. Maggie secured the stolen evidence in her saddlebags and mounted her mare. "Then we'd better make sure this reaches people who can use it." But as they prepared to flee the valley, she looked back one more time at the place that had started as worthless land and become the key to a conspiracy that stretched to the territorial capital. 25 cents had bought her the truth about her husband's murder and the deaths of innocent families. Now she had to live long enough to make sure that truth saw daylight. The mustang called once more from the rim above, wild and free, leading them away from the valley of buried secrets toward whatever justice they could find in a territory built on carefully maintained lies. Judge Abram Dyer's chambers occupied the finest building in Millfield, its polished mahogany and leather-bound law books designed to intimidate anyone who entered seeking justice. But as Margaret Rowland knocked on his door that morning, she carried evidence that could transform those impressive surroundings into the walls of a prison. "Mrs. Rowland." Dyer looked up from his desk with the practiced smile of a man accustomed to controlling conversations before they began. "I understand you've had some excitement lately. Please sit down." Maggie remained standing, her saddlebags heavy with the documents she and Evelyn had stolen from Broderick's office. The judge was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 50, with silver-touched hair and the kind of smooth features that suggested he'd never worked with his hands. "I've come to discuss my valley, Judge Dyer." "Ah, yes, your 25-cent purchase. Quite the bargain. His tone suggested amusement, but his eyes were calculating. "I trust you're not having second thoughts about the transaction?" "On the contrary, I'm having thoughts about what the transaction really purchased." Dyer's fingers drummed against his desktop, the first sign of nervousness Maggie had detected. "I'm afraid I don't follow." "Mineral rights, mining claims, access to copper and silver deposits worth more than this entire territory." Maggie pulled out one of the geological surveys and placed it on his desk. "Funny thing about legal documents, Judge, they leave a paper trail." The color drained from Dyer's face as he recognized the stolen report. His composure cracked for just an instant, revealing something cold and dangerous beneath the polished exterior. "Where did you get this?" "From the people you trusted to keep your secrets buried." Maggie leaned forward, her voice deadly quiet. "How many families did you murder for those mining rights, Judge? How many innocent people died because you decided their land was worth more than their lives?" Dyer stood slowly, his hand moving, toward the desk drawer where Maggie glimpsed the grip of a pistol. But before he could reach it, the door burst open and Ranger Broderick entered, his uniform wrinkled and his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night hunting his escaped prisoners. "She knows everything," Broderick said without preamble. "The tunnel, the bodies, the mineral surveys. She's got documentary evidence." "How much evidence?" Dyer's voice was ice-cold now, the judicial mask completely abandoned. "Enough to hang us both." Broderick closed the door behind him, the click of the lock echoing like a gunshot. Along with half the territorial government, Maggie realized her mistake too late. She'd come to confront Dyer, hoping to shock him into confession, but instead she'd walked into a trap. The two men who'd orchestrated years of murder now stood between her and the door, and the evidence that could expose them was locked in saddlebags she couldn't reach. "The question," Dyer said, settling back into his chair with recovered composure, "is what to do about our problem." "Same thing we've always done," Broderick replied. "Eliminate it." But before either man could move, a commotion erupted outside. Shouting voices, the thunder of running feet, and above it all, the wild cry of the mustang from the valley. Dyer moved to the window, his face darkening as he took in whatever scene was unfolding in the street below. "What is it?" Broderick demanded. "Your daughter," Dyer said coldly. "She's in the town square with a crowd of settlers, reading from what appears to be official documents." Evelyn Hart had chosen her moment perfectly. While Maggie confronted the architects of the conspiracy, the young woman had taken their evidence directly to the people of Millfield, reading aloud the damning correspondence that proved years of systematic murder and theft. "That little bitch," Broderick snarled, reaching for his rifle. You'll do nothing." Dyer's voice cracked like a whip. "Shooting your own daughter in the town square would be somewhat difficult to explain as an accident." The judge moved to his safe, spinning the combination with practiced efficiency. When it opened, Maggie saw stacks of currency, land deeds, and something that made her blood freeze: bundles of dynamite. "We're going to solve all our problems at once," Dyer announced, loading the explosives into a leather satchel. "A tragic mining accident at the valley will eliminate the evidence. Silence Mrs. Rowland, and provide a reasonable explanation for any irregularities people might have heard about." "And Evelyn?" Dyer's smile was colder than winter morning. "Grief-stricken daughters sometimes make poor decisions when they lose their fathers." "Another tragic accident, I'm afraid. The plan was brutally simple and devastatingly effective. Destroy the valley with explosives, killing Maggie and burying the evidence forever. Then eliminate Evelyn as an emotionally unstable young woman whose accusations died with her. The kind of clean solution that had kept their conspiracy hidden for 7 years. But as they prepared to leave, the mustang's cry echoed through the streets again, closer now. Followed by the sound of breaking glass and startled shouts, Dyer peered out the window again, his composure finally cracking entirely. "What now?" "The horse," Maggie said, and despite everything she found herself smiling. "It's found the scent." The wild mustang had followed her to town, drawn by the same instinct that connected them across miles of empty country. And now it was doing what wild things do when they sense danger to their herd, creating chaos that would give the threatened member a chance to escape. The mustang's rampage through Millfield's main street had drawn every able-bodied person in town to their windows and doorways. Judge Dyer's attempt to slip away unnoticed with his satchel of explosives instead became a very public procession, with Evelyn Hart's voice still echoing from the town square as she read the damning evidence to anyone who would listen. Signed by Judge Abram Dyer, authorizing the forced relocation of the Castelli family, with compensation listed as unnecessary due to subsequent accident. Maggie heard the words as Dyer dragged her toward his carriage, Broderick following with his rifle trained on her back. The crowd was growing larger, angrier, as Evelyn revealed the scope of the conspiracy that had claimed their neighbors, friends, and family members. "Drive," Dyer commanded his coachman. "The valley quickly." But the mustang had other plans. The wild horse appeared from nowhere, charging directly at the carriage with the fury of something that had witnessed too much death and destruction. It struck the lead horse with enough force to send the entire rig sideways, spilling passengers and explosives across the dusty street. Maggie rolled free of the wreckage, her hands scrambling for the scattered dynamite before Dyer could recover it. But Broderick was quicker, his rifle swinging toward her with deadly intent. The shot that rang out came from an unexpected direction. Evelyn Hart stood at the end of the street, holding her father's backup pistol with hands that shook but didn't waver. "That's for Samuel Pike," she called out. "And for all the others." Broderick stumbled, clutching his shoulder, his rifle clattering across the street. But Dyer had recovered the explosives, and now he backed toward a horse that had broken free from the overturned carriage. "This isn't over," he snarled at Maggie. "That valley will be destroyed, and everyone who threatens our work will die with it." He spurred the stolen horse toward the edge of town, the satchel of dynamite secure in his grip. Maggie looked around desperately for a way to follow, but her own mare was nowhere in sight. The mustang appeared beside her, its storm cloud coat lathered with sweat, its dark eyes meeting hers with unmistakable invitation. "You're wild," she said. "You've never been ridden." The horse snorted and moved closer, presenting its side. In that moment, Maggie understood that some partnerships transcend training or tradition. Sometimes survival requires trust between creatures who recognize something essential in each other. She swung onto the mustang's back, her hands tangling in its rough mane. The horse exploded into motion, carrying her through the streets of Millfield and out across the open country toward the valley where everything had begun. Behind them, Evelyn's voice continued reading from the stolen documents, each revelation sending shockwaves through the crowd. The truth was finally surfacing, but it would mean nothing if Dyer succeeded in destroying the evidence buried in the valley. The mustang ran like the wind itself, sure-footed across terrain that would have challenged a trained cavalry mount. Maggie had never experienced speed like this, never felt so connected to the wild heart of the country that had claimed her husband and so many others. They reached the valley as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Dyer was already there, working frantically to place charges around the tunnel entrance. His plan was simple and brutal: collapse the entire eastern wall, burying the evidence and anyone who tried to retrieve it. "Mrs. Rowland!" he called out as she approached on the mustang. "How thoughtful of you to join me for the finale." "You can't destroy the truth by burying it deeper," Dyer laughed, the sound echoing off the valley walls. "Truth is whatever the survivors choose to remember. And you won't be among the survivors." He struck a match, the flame dancing in the growing shadows. But before he could light the fuse, the mustang charged. The wild horse had no fear of explosives or gunfire, only the instinct to protect territory that held the bones of its ancestors. It struck Dyer with the force of a mountain storm, sending him tumbling away from the charges. The match flew wide, its flame dying in the dust. But Dyer wasn't finished. He rolled to his feet and drew a pistol, aiming not at Maggie, but at the mustang that had ruined his plans. "Some things are too wild to live," he snarled. The gunshot echoed across the valley like thunder. But the cry of pain came from Dyer, not the horse. Evelyn Hart emerged from behind the rocks, still holding her father's weapon, her young face aged by the weight of necessary violence. "I followed you," she said simply. Someone had to witness the end. Dyer fell to his knees, clutching his chest, his grand conspiracy reduced to desperate gasps in the gathering twilight. Around them, the valley waited in silence, its buried secrets finally ready to see daylight. "The truth," Maggie said, standing over the dying man. "Tell me why you killed my husband." "Because," Dyer wheezed, "he discovered the railway survey was falsified. The route was changed to avoid the valley, to hide the mining operation. Until we could clear out the families." The words cost him his remaining strength. Judge Abram Dyer died as the last light faded from the sky, his confession echoing off stone walls that had kept secrets too long. 3 months later, Margaret Rowland stood at the edge of her valley, watching a very different kind of excavation. Instead of secret tunnels dug in darkness, territorial investigators worked in full sunlight, carefully removing the remains of murdered families for proper burial. The evidence she and Evelyn had gathered had reached the territorial capital, where honest officials still existed among the corrupt. The conspiracy had unraveled quickly once the light was shone on it. A network of murder and theft that reached into the highest levels of territorial. Government Ranger Broderick had survived, his wounds only to face trial for 14 counts of murder. His confession, given in exchange for life imprisonment instead of hanging, had implicated officials across 3 territories. The cleanup would take years, but the foundation had been laid for justice. Mrs. Rowland. Maggie turned to see Evelyn Hart approaching, her young face showing new lines of maturity, but also something that hadn't been there before: peace. "The surveyor says they'll have the dam removed by next week," Evelyn reported. "Water should be flowing through the valley again by spring." Already, life was returning to the blocked land. Green shoots pushed through soil that had been barren for 7 years. Birds nested in the cliffs where only ravens had called before. And the mustang, no longer wild but not quite tamed, grazed peacefully in grass that grew richer each day. "What will you do now?" Maggie asked. Evelyn's smile held both sadness and determination. "The territorial governor offered me a position investigating other suspicious land deals. Seems there's a need for people who understand how these conspiracies work." It was fitting justice. The daughter, forced to live with corruption, would spend her life exposing it. Maggie felt a surge of pride for the young woman who had chosen truth over comfort, justice over safety. "And you?" Evelyn asked. "Will you stay in the valley?" Maggie looked across her 25-cent purchase, now legally confirmed as containing mineral rights worth more than she could spend in 10 lifetimes. The copper and silver deposits were real and valuable, but she'd already made her decision about them. "I'm donating the mining rights to the Territorial Development Fund," she said. "The money will go towards schools and hospitals, things that help people instead of harming them. The valley would be restored, but not exploited. The families who died there would be properly buried and remembered, and the water that had been blocked for 7 years would flow free again, nourishing land that had been left to die." As they spoke, a group of riders approached from town. The new territorial marshal, sent to investigate the conspiracy, led a delegation that included several families interested in settling the restored valley. Life was already moving to reclaim what death had taken. "There's something else," Evelyn said quietly. "I found this among my father's papers." She handed Maggie a letter, yellowed with age and marked with Thomas Rowland's familiar handwriting. It was addressed to the Territorial Surveyor's Office, reporting irregularities in the railroad route and requesting investigation of possible corruption. He was going to expose everything, Maggie realized. That's why they killed him. He was braver than they expected, braver than they could afford. Maggie folded the letter carefully, adding it to the collection of documents that would become part of the official record. Thomas's death would be remembered not as an unfortunate accident, but as the murder of a man who died fighting for truth. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson, the mustang approached with its distinctive ground-covering gait. The wild horse had become something more than either wild or tame, a creature that chose its own path while maintaining its essential nature. Maggie ran her hand along the horse's neck, feeling the strength and independence that had carried her through the darkest moments of her fight for justice. Like the valley itself, the mustang represented something that could be temporarily contained, but never truly defeated. They thought silence. And stone could bury the truth, she said to Evelyn as the stars began to appear overhead. But the valley remembered, and so did I. The wind carried the sound of flowing water where workers had already begun dismantling sections of the dam. By morning, the first trickle would flow through the valley for the first time in 7 years. By spring it would be a river again, feeding grass and trees and the dreams of families ready to build honest lives on honest ground. Ravens called from the rim above, but their voices carried different messages now. Not warnings of buried secrets, but celebrations of truth finally exposed to daylight. The Valley of the Dead had become a valley of renewal, where justice bloomed like flowers after a long winter. Margaret Rowland, no longer just a grieving widow, but a woman who had faced corruption and emerged victorious, watched the darkness gather over her 25-cent kingdom. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight belonged to peace, and to the knowledge that some truths are worth any price. The mustang called once, wild and free, and the sound echoed off stone walls that no longer held secrets, only memories of those who had fought for justice and won. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.